Do you think in pictures? Welcome to another installment in the Over My Shoulder Bible Study series. These brief videos are designed to help augment the sermon that I preach each Sunday with the Missouri Street Church of Christ here in Baytown, Texas. This particular Sunday I'll be preaching from the Book of Hosea, and Hosea is packed with pictures. It's chock full of imagery. James Limburg, a commentator on Hosea, put it like this: behind the sayings in the Hosea book is a person of unusual imagination. The imagery used to speak of God and people is astonishing in its power and variety. His imaginative creativity in speaking about God stands as an example for artists, musicians, theologians, and all others who try to express biblical teachings in fresh and effective ways. Well, let's notice some of those images, some of those pictures in the book of Hosea. And let's think about just how God depicts himself in Hosea. You might be surprised. One of the first references in Hosea, God's image of himself is like a moth. I am like a moth to Ephraim. Ephraim is shorthand for Israel throughout this book. In the same verse, he'll also speak of himself as rot, like rot to the people of Judah. Later on, just a couple of verses later, he'll refer to himself as a lion. He'll refer to himself as a lion or a leopard 3 or 4 times in Hosea. In verse 3, in chapter 6, just a few verses later, he refers to himself as like the rainfall. Have you ever heard it rain? Have you ever watched the showers come down and then thought about God raining down blessings? Well, about God himself as the rain. That's the way the book is in the beginning, in the middle, and the end, chock full of images. Here toward the end, in chapter 13 and verse 8, he speaks of himself as like a bear robbed of her cubs. Also in chapter 14, in verse 5, I'm like the dew in the morning to Israel. Or he speaks of himself as like a tree, like a juniper or a cypress tree to Israel. Well, those are just some of the images. How do you picture God? And if you were going to try to give an image to someone to describe God, what image would you choose? Hosea uses a wide variety. Now, one of the dominant images throughout the book is of God and his relationship with his people Israel as like a husband and a wife, or like a father and a son. Here in chapter 1, 2, and 3, the image of a husband and wife is dominant. And of course, the analogy, the parable of Hosea and his relationship with his wife Gomer is at the fore. Just a little later in chapter 7, we get a different image, a very different image though. Chapter 7 and verse 11. Now God is a bird catcher, someone who's going to try to trap a bird, and his people, unfortunately, is like a dove that has no sense. In chapter 9 and verse 10, he pictures himself as someone hiking through the wilderness or the desert, and they come across some grapes in the desert. The grapes are his people, and God is the hiker. In chapter 10 and verse 11, he depicts himself as a farmer, and Israel is like a trained heifer. Over in chapter 14 and verse 4, God is the one who's the doctor or the physician, and his people is, well, they're like a sick patient to him, sick with sin. Now, that covers God and God's people, but what about the relationship of images to just God's people in particular? Again, you'll find images strewn throughout the whole letter. That idea of Israel as a stubborn heifer in chapter 4 and verse 16. Have you ever been called a bull-headed? That's not too far from the imagery that Hosea is speaking of here. In the same verse, he speaks of Israel as a lamb, like lambs in the meadow, and God is the shepherd. In chapter 7, verse 4 through 7, he speaks of God's people, his people, is like an overheated oven. And in verse 8, it's like a half-baked cake. Maybe most surprising of all, God's people is depicted as here in verse 9 of chapter 7 is like an elderly man who doesn't act his age. Or like in verse 16, the last verse of chapter 7, a bow, like an archery bow that is defective. A wild donkey, chapter 8 and verse 9. God's people are like a vine in chapter 10 and verse 1. They're also like the morning mist, the dew, or the chaff in verse 3 of chapter 13. And then in chapter 14 and verse 7, they're like a garden of grain or a garden full of grapevines. Well, this doesn't even begin to exhaust the imagery that's found in Hosea. This is just something of a sampling. It'd be a good exercise for you to just sit down for a few minutes and as you peruse the book to write down every picture or image that you find, whether it relates to God or His people, both, or someone or something else. And let that help inform you and enrich your vocabulary and your way of thinking about how you talk about God and His way with other people. Picture that. Grace and peace be with you.